All right, thanks for coming to the second Illuminations lecture of the year. It's very good to have everyone here and to have Tom visiting us from Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, where he's a member of the philosophy faculty there. By way of introduction, I will just tell you a little bit about Tom's work. He's published a few books. Most recently is Plastic Bodies, Rebuilding Sensation After Phenomenology. Now, is that out yet, Tom?
Next month.
Next month, okay, so forthcoming. And then The End of Phenomenology, Metaphysics and the New Realism, and Levinas Unenriched. He's also edited a few collections, A History of Habit from Aristotle to Bourdieu, and Itinerant Philosophy on Alfonso Lingus. And we're glad to have Tom was able to make it. He just got back from Russia where he did the Winter Philosophy School there, so we can maybe talk a little bit about that afterwards. But today he's going to present some work on John Dewey, How to Grow a Democracy, John Dewey on the Plasticity of the Pupil. So please join me in warmly welcoming Tom Sparrow.
Right, so thank you everybody for coming out today, and thanks to Donovan and Patrick for inviting me, and for Dan for putting me up for a couple of nights. My paper has Dewey in the title, but it's a little bit misleading because it's as much about Catherine Malabou as it is about John Dewey, and you'll see that very quickly. I guess it's customary to say this is part of a larger project, but I'm not really sure if it's going to be a larger project, or if it's part of a larger project, or it's a miniature version of what the larger project would be. I'm not really sure where to go with it, or what kind of book I'd want to write based on this paper. But I'll say two things. So I basically have two concerns. On the one hand is I'd like to tell like kind of a slightly broader story about the history of this concept of plasticity in philosophy. That's sort of my one purpose. And the second purpose is to use Malabou to read John Dewey and the American and James, American philosophy in a kind of more politically interesting way than you might otherwise read it. So that's sort of my agenda in the paper. And I'll talk a little bit about democracy and education towards the end of the paper, but it's a little bit schematic. So this is the kind of second iteration of the second draft of this paper. So I'm looking for lots of feedback if you have any ways for me to improve it. Okay, so anyone who's read one or two sentences, or two or three sentences about Catherine Malabou knows that plasticity is her original signature idea, as Clayton Crockett put it in his foreword to her book, Plasticity at the Dusk of Writing. Anyone who's read 4 or 5 sentences about Malabou knows that she draws plasticity out of her reading of Hegel and elaborates the figure of plasticity in her book, The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, and Dialectic, which began its life as a dissertation written under Jacques Derrida. Anyone who's read an entire paragraph about Malabou knows that the concept of plasticity has taken on a life of its own in her writing, that she's situated herself at the periphery of current research in the neurosciences, and that she is as much interested in neuroplasticity, the neuroplasticity of the brain, as she is in plasticity as an ontological figure. Among continental philosophers, her trajectory is both unique and promising in that it attempts to achieve a balanced synthesis of hard science and philosophy, one that is at once informed about current empirical research, historically rich, and self-consciously critical about its political implications. Apart from Hegel and neurobiology, Malabou finds plasticity at work in a number of other thinkers in the history of philosophy, including Ravissant, Heidegger, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Derrida, and Freud. Reading her books, one gets the impression that she sees it everywhere, that she cannot help but find plasticity lurking around every corner, and it's actually easy to be convinced that it is indeed able to be found everywhere. One place she has not found it, however, is in the American philosophical tradition, which is where I first encountered the concept of plasticity, specifically in the philosophical psychology of William James and John Dewey. Perhaps this is because plasticity in American philosophy is hiding right there in plain sight, right there in the middle of a philosophical tradition that does not fit neatly into the terrain that's been divided up into analytic and continental camps. Plasticity is a concept explicitly theorized by James and Dewey, and often in ways that might surprise admirers of Malabou's project. While nothing I will say here today contradicts the claim that plasticity is Malabou's signature idea, it should nevertheless qualify our understanding of her idea's originality. not saying it's not original, but it's original in a kind of qualified sense. I should say too, the reading time of my paper is around 45 minutes. You see a kind of temporal representation. My aim here is certainly not to expose Malabou's ignorance of the American tradition or to mitigate the force of her work. On the contrary, what her thinking does is build a bridge between the two continents. Toward this end, I find that reading her alongside the Americans, as I refer to them, the Americans, James, Dewey, and a couple of others, reading her alongside the Americans helps us appreciate the broader and nuanced philosophical history of the concept of plasticity and deepens the political stakes of thinking this concept. It complicates and enriches Malabou's version of plasticity, which carries ontological, social, ethical, and aesthetic implications. The same could be said of plasticity for James and especially Dewey, whose mobilization of plasticity makes significant contributions to the philosophy of education and pedagogy. The remainder of my paper is divided into 4 sections. Excuse me. The first introduces Malabou's version of plasticity and what's at stake in her promotion of it. And here I draw primarily from her short book, What Should We Do With Our Brain, published in translation in 2008, originally published in 2004. The second section looks at the figure of plasticity in the American pragmatist tradition, specifically James's 1890 The Principles of Psychology, and 2 complementary works by Dewey, Democracy in Education and Human Nature and Conduct. All 3 of these works approach plasticity through the lens of habit, a concept that features in the grand scheme of Malabou's philosophy, but to a lesser extent than it does for the Americans. In the third section, I draw some contrast between Malabou and the Americans, but I'm going to skip that section. And in the final section, I suggest that these readings, or reading these 3 thinkers together, James, Dewey, and Malabou, provides us with a very provocative critique of how contemporary capitalism conspires to sacrifice our personal and collective plasticity to industrial and economic exigencies, only to then market this plasticity back to us as the kind of must-have biotech solution for our intellectual atrophy. And I'm thinking here of Lumosity. Has anybody seen the Lumosity commercials? For me, that's what I have in mind when I think about plasticity and the way it's sort of sold back to us after it's already taken away from us. So I'll come back to Lumosity later on. Okay, so the first section, Malabou's concept of plasticity. In her early book, The Future of Hegel, Malabou wants to show how, for Hegel, both the subject, who is shaped by the dialectic, and the dialectic itself are both plastic structures, both prone to what she calls self-othering. The dialectical process itself is interpreted as a form of plasticity, or as that which governs the plasticity of forms, in particular the temporal form of the subject's experience of self and other. The centrality accorded to plasticity in this text is meant to demonstrate that alterity permeates the Hegelian vision. So it is emphatically not the case that Hegel presents us with the totalizing philosophy that Levinas and other late 20th century critics says he does. The takeaway of Malabou's early text is that plasticity is a differential form. Where there is plasticity, there is a structure that differs from itself. The lesson Malabou learns from Hegel is that there is plasticity everywhere. In its earliest articulation, and at the most general level, Malabou's plasticity designates a structure's capacity to at once receive and give form. She says, in ordinary speech, it designates suppleness, a faculty of adaptation, and the ability to evolve. This formulation is introduced in The Future of Hegel and gets repeated and developed throughout all of her work, so that plasticity comes to signify, in her terms, a formative metamorphosis that exhibits a threefold structure. In Malabou's hands, plasticity entails, on the one hand, the capacity to receive form, which she calls malleability or pliability, the capacity to give form, as in the case of plastic surgery, and the capacity to annihilate form, as in the case of plastic explosives. It's this last element, what she calls destructive plasticity, that remains unthought in both neuroscience and psychoanalysis, according to Malabou, but most crucial for understanding, for example, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease and traumatic experiences that completely reshape or depersonalize the subject. In the first dimension, the sort of receptive dimension, which is most often emphasized in neurobiology, or sorry, it's this receptive dimension that's first emphasized in neurobiology. Here the brain is typically seen as infinitely modifiable, capable of taking on endless forms and occasionally able to shape or repair itself. The overemphasis for Malabou on the receptive sense of plasticity has, as we will see a little later on, broad social and political consequences that affect our personal capacity for creative self-fashioning and the public's capacity to augment its collective plasticity. So she's ultimately concerned with the way in which a certain dimension, this receptive or malleable dimension of plasticity, the narrative about plasticity that emphasizes this malleability, right? She's interested in the way that narrative gets sort of fed back into, I don't know, political life, right? Has these political implications. That's the most interesting thing from my perspective about her work. In the neurological register, then, plasticity roughly amounts to thinking of the brain as something modifiable, formable, and formative at the same time, says Malabou. The brain's form and consequent subjectivity emerges through normal physiological development, individual experience, education, and intellectual exercise, traumatic injury, and so forth. Given this picture of development, what Malabou ultimately wants to highlight is the simple fact that the brain has a history, that it is historicized and therefore susceptible to environmental and temporal environmental conditions and the effects of time. Today it's possible, she urges, to speak of what she calls a constitutive history of the brain. The problem, as she sees it, is that its history and its implications remain largely hidden from public view. A book like What Should We Do With Our Brain, then, is intended to awaken a consciousness of this historicity so that we might harness the potential of the brain before it is seized and capitalized on by someone else, namely commercial and political interests. The titular question of Malabou's book, What Should We Do With Our Brain, expresses her marked concern for the potential of plasticity, for subjects endowed with an unforeseeable future of creativity, but vulnerable to the depredations of the neoliberal economy and what she calls its neuronal ideology. If the subject's primary asset is its suppleness, then this tripartite plasticity of the subject's brain, in other words, in other words, the suppleness, this tripartite, right, plasticity, if this is the subject's primary asset, then Malabou's practical interest is to warn of the dangers of remaining in the dark about our brain's historicity. Later, I'll suggest that what she's basically suggesting is we need a kind of neuroliteracy, right? A better education about our brains. When Malabou says that the brain is historicized, she means more specifically that the synaptic connections which dynamically form between our neurons are what she refers to as synaptic efficacy. These are prone to the influence of experience and what she calls the impressions of existence. That's her phrase. This is the upside of its plasticity and what enables each individual brain to learn from what happens to it. Since the totality of a person's experience is singular, the efficacy of a person's brain is likewise singular. The singularity of its expression, however, will vary according to how much its neural network is determined by external forces designed to mold it. Cliches, ideology, propaganda, rote training, prefabricated habits, and other impressions, and how much of its neural network is formed by neurologically informed education, work, art, and play. A person's agency in thought and action will then be determined neither exclusively by chance nor by necessity, but by some unique combination of both. Her or his agency will remain supple or efficacious so long as the capacity to learn and to grow, which persists throughout life, barring any accident or injury, this agency will remain supple so long as this capacity to learn or grow is nurtured through education and intellectual endeavor, or through what James and Dewey would call the cultivation of intelligent habits. Roughly speaking, these habits are formally progressive and capable of adaptation, as opposed to the kind of bad habits which serve no apparent purpose and are best broken if possible. It's precisely synaptic efficacy that stands to be lost when the habits we acquire are unthinking or unintelligent, or when the plasticity of the brain of the brain is not regarded as a precious and a vulnerable asset. Okay, so that's the part on Malabou. I'll talk a little bit about James and Dewey. So the idea that there's a suppleness to the brain and that experience plays a constitutive role in the formation of the brain, and by extension the formation of agency, is found in several 19th and 20th century American thinkers, including William James, John Dewey, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The locus classicus of this idea is chapter 4 of the first volume of James's Principles of Psychology, the famous chapter on habit, the first place I encountered this notion of plasticity. Here James asserts that habit has a material basis, that it's traceable to the neural network of the brain. The network, which is lodged in what James calls brain matter, he identifies as plastic. As what Malabou calls the impressions of existence flow into and out of the brain through the central nervous system, says James, this is a quote, "They leave their traces in the paths which they take. The only thing they can do is to deepen old paths or to make new ones. And the whole plasticity of the brain sums itself up in two words when we call it an organ in which currents pouring in from the sense organs make with extreme facility paths which do not easily disappear." Now in this formulation, James recapitulates what Malabou calls the receptive form of plasticity. But despite appearances, he does not limit plasticity to this single sense. James's concept of plasticity is, like Malabou's, is multidimensional. It names a certain form of being and as such articulates a kind of dynamic structural identity. It is a concept as formative for James as it is for Malabou. He defines it in the following way. This is a quote, "Plasticity in the wide sense of the word means the possession of a structure weak enough to yield to an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once." Here we have what Malabou calls the receptive and the donative senses of plasticity, represented in terms of a structure's relative strength and weakness. James's definition bears a sense of malleability, but also a sense of resistance, passive and active characteristics at the same time. It denotes what computer scientists would call an open an open architecture. At the center of plasticity, then, is a dialectical tension between activity and passivity that determines the physical and structural integrity or identity of whatever material body is in question. He goes on to add that each relatively stable phase of equilibrium in such a structure is marked by what we may call a new set of habits. So there's that close link between plasticity and habit for James. Habit, for James, has a wide influence that extends throughout the animate and inanimate worlds. It's not a feature proper to the organic or to the living. For humans, habits are embedded in the neural network of the brain and are constitutively dependent upon the plasticity of the brain's organic matter, on the one hand, and the environmental conditions in which that brain finds itself situated on the other. This is to say that human habits are themselves plastic, but their plasticity is enabled by the neuroplasticity of the brain in which they are lodged. And if our habits are important for our mental and physical well-being, then the maintenance of neuroplasticity is doubly crucial. It's no stretch to say then that James's concept of plasticity should elicit from us the same question posed by Malabou, namely, what should we do with our brain? Now, James's discussion of plasticity serves as a part of his, I've hit that point in my talk where I feel like I said plasticity so many times. It's starting to sound weird to me. I'm sorry, you have to keep hearing this. But his discussion of the P word serves as part of his exposition of the nature and function of habit. This is usually how it stands with Dewey as well, precisely because habit is foundational for how both of them conceive human nature and conduct, or the natural focus, which is the natural focus of their philosophical psychologies. As James sums it up, quote, "The phenomena of habit in living beings are due to the plasticity of the organic materials of which their bodies are composed." It's plasticity that determines the specific types of habit that take hold in an individual and which qualifies the degree to which the brain can accommodate simple or mechanical on the one hand, or complex, what he calls concatenated habits, and how many of these. It's perhaps important to note that James's qualification of the simple and complex corresponds to the modularity or quantitative intensification of by virtue of their organization into more or less complex systems of reflexes. It's tempting to conclude then that in the last analysis, James's view of habit is mechanistic. He does, after all, insist that the study of habit is primarily a lesson in physics, not physiology or psychology. But this would be a misplaced conclusion, and one that is best avoided by looking at how Dewey deepens the Jamesian concepts of plasticity and habit. So in Dewey, the qualitative distinction between simple habits and complex habits is enriched in two important ways. First, Dewey invites us to regard the mind as extended throughout the environment and the intellect as a concatenation of habits. If the mind is extended rather than locked in the head, this amplifies the importance of ecological or environmental life, which now for Dewey determines more intimately our intellectual and our practical power. And second, he distinguishes between what we might call progressive habits, or those propelled by intelligence and conducive to inquiry, and conservative habits, or those governed by mechanical repetition. Adopting a Nietzschean terminology, we might call the former active habits and the latter reactive habits. In Malabou's terms, progressive habits are products of the creative dimension of plasticity, whereas conservative habits are products of the receptive dimension of plasticity. Before saying more about Dewey and habit, however, we should get clear on what he means by plasticity. This is one of the most interesting, for me anyway, this is one of the most interesting sections in Dewey, particularly in Democracy and Education. This idea of plasticity is key to understanding the three terms that you find in, the three concepts that you find in a book like Democracy and Education: impulse, immaturity, and growth, which all go together. These ideas help constitute Dewey's naturalistic conception of education and, by extension, democracy. When we refer to someone as impulsive, we typically imply that their behavior is erratic or beyond their control. They're prone to capricious purchases or outbursts and at the mercy of these. When we call someone immature, we understand their immaturity as a lack of maturity, as a deficient stage of development. Normatively speaking, we insist that the immature work diligently toward maturity, preferably as soon as possible. It's this ideal that must be, it's the ideal, maturity that is, that must be reached by the immature, quintessentially the child, right? Grow up, we say. The very idea of growth, as Dewey makes clear, however, is laced with, the very idea of growth, this is something Dewey emphasizes, is laced with the negative value of immaturity. To grow is to be incomplete, deprived, lacking in whatever degree of perfection we might achieve one day in the future. Against each of these negative interpretations of impulse, immaturity, and growth, Dewey insists on the positive or the affirmative sense of them, right? Of the affirmative sense of impulse, immaturity, and growth. Each of these terms signifies a process imbued with its own value and its own potency. Each bears within it a capacity for creation, a power to change, a power of change that can be cultivated or stunted. And this is the power of plasticity. At the social level, plasticity is the power to change customs and institutionalized habits. As always for Dewey, this means changing the individuals who compose society. This power is latent in individuals and emphatically in the fundamental, what he calls docility of the young, the immature. This docility is too often, as Dewey puts it, too often looked upon not as an ability to learn whatever the world has to teach, but as a subjection to those instructions of others which reflect their current habits. To be truly docile is to be eager to learn all the lessons of active, inquiring, expanding experience. End of Dewey's quote. Docility is itself impulsive, and this impulsivity is an agent of change. By treating the plasticity of the immature not as the power of change and growth, but as clay to be molded and conformed to old customs and standards, creativity, curiosity, and innovation, or in a word, progress for Dewey, is extinguished. In Malabou's terms, when we treat the immature as plastic in the receptive rather than the donative or explosive senses, we risk mortifying or rigidifying their suppleness and the promise of their future. Much more than mechanical instinct or directionless energy, impulse, as I said, is an agent of change for Dewey. It's the organic creature's vital striving for newness, and it too is fundamentally plastic. For Dewey, it's impulse that renews our habits, whether individual or social, and provokes them to become something other. Impulse drives the desire to learn new things, to adopt new skills and new ways of doing. Once again, the young are full of impulse, which is to say, full of the capacity for creative change. But they're also a bundle of habits, many of which operate conservatively, mechanically, unthinkingly, and get adopted from social institutions like families, schools, and media. For Dewey, we're never without the structure provided by habit. It's a kind of second nature that acts upon us as first nature. This means that there's no such thing as a pure impulse. Every impulse meets with an established habit that receives it, interprets its meaning, and acts or reacts to it. Dewey explains that in the life of the individual, this is Dewey speaking here, instinctive activity comes first. But an individual begins life as a baby, and babies are dependent beings whose activities could continue at most for only a few hours, were it not for the presence and aid of adults with their formed habits. The upshot here is that obviously babies, even though they're hyper-impulsive, right, they're always met with these adult habits, right at the beginning. Even though impulse comes first in time, structurally it is dependent upon habit, initially the habit of parents and other caregivers. And this is just to say that impulse is always locked in a dialectical relation with habits that operate as more or less efficient responses to the environmental conditions that gave rise to them and which make up the institutions built to cope with these conditions. Without impulse, the habits embodied in our institutions would never evolve to deal with changing environmental conditions. When our habits become routine, they're incapable of dealing with novelty and with accident, with social evolution, which requires innovative new habits. The growth of a society's institutions, then, is dependent upon the creative plasticity of impulse, or the growth of the individuals that make up society. Specifically, it depends, among other things, on an educational system that is hospitable to the plasticity of individuals as individuals, and that nourishes their capacity for growth. Plasticity and dependency, then, are the two basic components of the capacity for growth, by which Dewey means, and this is his wording, the cumulative movement of action toward a later result. Right? So growth is the cumulative movement of action toward a later result. We have already seen that impulse depends upon habit and vice versa. And we know quite well how the very young depend upon adults for their survival. But once again, for Dewey, dependency does not necessarily entail a lack or a weakness. He wants to give dependency this affirmative reading. In fact, it's an essential component of community because it represents the capacity of one individual to thrive on and learn from others. In Dewey's words, quote, "Children are gifted with an equipment of the first order for social intercourse. The native mechanism of the child and his impulses all tend to facile social responsiveness." This is evidence that human nature is first and foremost social. And here we must keep in mind the dialectic of impulse and conduct. Human nature for Dewey is not, as he puts it, egotistically self-centered. Or put differently, it is impulsively social. Right? It's impulsively social. For Dewey, then, there's something natural about the social disposition, and it's precisely this condition of interdependence. In Democracy and Education, plasticity is identified as, and this is kind of definition, the specific adaptability of an immature creature for growth. As we have already seen, this adaptability is not merely an ability to take on form in response to external influence, but the power to form habits best suited to live and thrive in a given environment. In Dewey's words, the meaning of plasticity, and here's a bit of a longer quote, "The meaning of plasticity lies near the pliable elasticity by which some persons take on the color of their surroundings, while retaining their own bent," which is James' definition. But it's something deeper than this. It's essentially the ability to learn from experience, the power to retain from one experience something which is of avail in coping with the difficulties of a later situation. This means power to modify actions on the basis of the results of prior experiences, or the power to develop dispositions. Without it, the acquisition of habits is impossible. This this sort of definition here helps us get a better grasp of what he means when he calls growth the cumulative movement of action toward a later result. To grow is to develop new dispositions, new attitudes towards the environment. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, for Dewey, as opposed to Malabou, plasticity has sort of 4 dimensions, right? Taken together, form a kind of self-sustaining circuit of growth, right? It's receptive of form. We saw this in Malabou. It's the capacity to form new habits, right? Capacity to maintain one's form. We see this in Malabou as well, right? And most importantly, this capacity to form the habit of learning, right? Or to learn, sort of the ideal stage of growth. Growth then is not only a process that's formally plastic, it's the form of plasticity itself. There's this idea that the true intelligence, right, the ultimate goal of learning, right, is this taking this habit of learning to learn, right, this sort of self-sustaining education. Okay, so this last section, plasticity at work and at school. Both Malabou and the Americans acknowledge plasticity as a site of self-fashioning of the auto-constitution of the self. Malabou and Dewey, and to a lesser extent James, recognize the importance of experimentation and self-constitution, of exposing oneself to accidental forces and unforeseen encounters, and each sees the inherent vulnerability of plastic structures. But Malabou and the Americans also agree that plasticity is and must be a site of resistance. It's here that we find the critical edge of their collective vision of plasticity. And here I'm trying to read them all together. Even if today we remain ignorant of the multifaceted nature of our plasticity, as Malabou claims, the forces of contemporary capitalism know full well how to exploit it. Namely, by, as she puts it, confiscating the very meaning of plasticity and selling it back to us as mere flexibility. So if you read that little book, What Should We Do with Our Brain? Malabou says most people understand plasticity as a kind of flexibility. And there's this imperative, right, in various elements of our life, at work, at school, that we need to be flexible, right, to schedules, to time, and so forth. And this is essentially what plasticity is, and her claim is just, no, it's got more dimensions than this flexibility. But the narrative is that plasticity just equals flexibility. When plasticity, for Malabou, is conflated or confused with flexibility, the creative and the explosive dimensions drop out of the picture. The valorization of plasticity becomes the valorization of docility taken in the passive sense. According to Malabou, it's the quote, "To be flexible is to receive a form or an impression, to be able to fold oneself, to take the fold, not to give it, to be docile, to not explode. Indeed, what flexibility lacks is the resource of giving form, the power to create, to invent, or even to erase an impression, the power to style. Flexibility is plasticity minus its genius." End of quote. Today, it's imperative that we resist this maneuver, where flexibility is converted into the ideological avatar of plasticity. The resistance happens precisely by becoming keenly aware of our plasticity, of the historicity of the brain, and the means necessary to maintain its potency. Contemporary society enacts what she calls the confiscation of plasticity through what she calls, as I said earlier, the neuronal ideology at work in the spirit of capitalism. This happens not only at the level of popular discourse about plasticity, specifically the discourse of neuroplasticity, but also at the level of what James calls brain matter. In short, our brains have been effectively hijacked. This is a possibility, Malabou tells us, because the neuronal and the social, matter and discourse, dialectically co-determine one another. The brain's historicity opens it to the discursive and material effects of capitalist institutions, which encourage behaviors, both productive and consumptive, necessary to reproduce the conditions of profitability. Behavior that is habitual in the negative sense, which is to say addictive, unintelligent, unconscious, and ideally automated. Such behavior involves not a repetition productive of difference or intellectual growth, but a repetition that is at once mechanical and manipulable. The downside of our plasticity, then, is that it readily becomes rigid, loses its suppleness through repetition or inertia, and finds itself vulnerable to exploitation by some force that seeks to install it into the machinery of capitalism. In part, this exploitation is prepared by some force that seeks to, in part, this exploitation is prepared by our educational institutions, insofar as they are ignorant of plasticity. It's further prepared by many of the practices we have adopted in the digital age, for instance, online short-form reading and multitasking. There's research on neuroscientists doing research on the effects of short-term and long-term, short-form and long-form reading on the brain. I'm only beginning to read about this stuff. An agent who has lost his or her suppleness is liable to find him or herself working in a mind-numbing, precarious job for an employer who demands that he or she adapt him or herself to whatever task and temporality the job requires, whether it enables him or her to flourish as an individual or not. This worker will be told that his or her flexibility will enable him or her to cope with the contingency of the market, that his or her plasticity will make him or her productive and marketable. I only have him in here, then I have her, and so I just decided to read them both. It didn't come out very well, I apologize. Contemporary capitalism's abundance of temporary precarious labor demands workers who are maximally flexible, ready at the drop of a hat to adapt to shifting work conditions, job descriptions, and availability and schedules. It demands that they be infinitely tolerant of the pressures of the precarious labor market. The ability and willingness to be infinitely adaptable to market demands is regarded as a virtue or a habit by employers, is regarded as a virtue in the sense of a habit by employers. Potential employees feel compelled to acquire this virtue for fear that a lack of flexibility will render them unemployable. The virtue of flexibility, however, embodies what Malabou calls the closed system of plasticity. So this idea of plasticity is flexibility is this closed sense. This is the sense of plasticity most prevalent in mainstream neurobiological research and the commercial business of neuroplasticity, exemplified by companies like Lumosity, which markets so-called brain games, which are supposedly based on the science of neuroplasticity and designed to keep our minds sharp. The implication being that without such brain games, you will experience a slow and pathetic decline into senility and dementia. Luckily for us, we can buy back the suppleness we lose at the hands of consumer culture and its various commercial media. This is what Malabou means by neuronal ideology. I'll kind of just summarize this section. It reminds me of that scene in Fight Club. You guys have all seen Fight Club, where they go into the liposuction clinic, right, and they get all the human fat and they turn it into soap to sell it back to the women who they had extracted it from. That's what I think Lumosity is doing with our plasticity. Or not Lumosity. Lumosity is just selling us the plasticity back to us, right? Okay. So whether that's helpful or not, I'm not sure. But it's an image, nonetheless. So in a similar way, contemporary society works to arrest our plasticity for, by example, substituting short-form reading on social media for traditional long-form reading, and by replacing any number of immersive, generative experiences, what we might call the original brain games, with virtual and televisual entertainment, only to turn around and sell the suppleness of our plasticity back to us via Lumosity and other commercial plasticity peddlers. Here we see the commodification of plasticity affected by Malabou's neuronal ideology. This process can be resisted, I think, and I'm using Malabou and Dewey in conjunction here, can be resisted with education, particularly education about the brain, particularly education of the brain, what we might call a neuroliteracy. The politics of neuroliteracy must begin from the premise that plasticity is as much a public good that keeps society supple, ready for change, and ready for creative evolution. Instead of brain games and other intellectual substitutes, a proper understanding and institutionalization of the educational process can help us cultivate the genuinely intelligent habits that maintain what Dewey calls the precious part of plasticity. This requires us first to understand that students are educated indirectly through their environments. here I'm just plagiarizing Dewey a little bit, their intellectual and practical habits are always adjustments to the exigent. Adults consciously control the kind of education which the immature get is by controlling the environment in which they act and hence think and feel. End of quote. Two things must be noted here. First, Dewey does not rule out the possibility that education can occur without direction, unconsciously or in an uncontrolled environment, as it were. Second, it's an ineffective form of education which tries to transfer knowledge or habits directly from teacher to student without regard for how that knowledge or how those habits might be wielded by the student to better adapt herself or to her environment. In other words, a successful educative strategy is one that recognizes that learning is rooted in the dialectical relation between habit and environment, which is to say, in the plasticity of the pupil. The student's immaturity must be taken on its own terms, not made to conform to an ideal of maturity prescribed by adults and teachers. The latter is a recipe for conservatism, not progress, and it's best achieved. It is best achieved by rote learning, not education for the sake of independence. That is, conservatism is best achieved by rote learning, not education for the sake of independence. Almost done here. Two more pages. So students and the immature more generally acquire their original set of habits from their unique socioeconomic background, according to Dewey. More often than not, a student's original set of habits reproduces materially the class conduct into which she was born. Her original habits conserve the social order and morality she inherits at birth, and in large measure, she will remain under its control, or under their control. If any of her inherited habits are to be replaced, she will need the tools to examine and replace them. She will need to think critically about the conduct she's adopted, which means first resisting the automatic reproduction of the habits embodied by her class. Habits reproduced by rote are what Dewey calls bad, that is, conservative habits. If new habits are to take hold, they must be the kind that conform to the impulse of the student, that enable the student to operate more effectively and innovatively in her environment. Habit formation is not merely an intellectual project. The moral problem, as Dewey sees it, is how to direct the youthful impulse in such a way that is not simply discharged, but discharged in a way that carves out intelligent or complex habits in the brain and allows the student to meet new challenges with the skill of an artist, not the routine behavior of an industrial worker. This is in large measure the task of education. Intelligent habits are, thus, more akin to artistic ability than they are to technical skill. They require a different style of education, where the latter involves mechanical repetition, results from rote memorization, and mimics automation. Intelligent habits, which is to say progressive habits, are mostly in our control. They are not merely automatic. Intelligent habits, or what Dewey calls good habits, are a product of the will. They render us adept at navigating not only foreseeable but also unforeseeable problems posed by the environment, and this is what makes them progressive. They are tools that can be wielded at will and deployed with creative facility. Such efficiency requires a kind of unity of the self, a formal integrity that we find articulated in James's concept of plasticity, which also finds expression in Malabou's claim that, quote, plasticity refers to the spontaneous organization of fragments. Today, the nervous system presents the clearest and most striking model of this type of organization. Or as James puts it in the Principles, with rhetoric appropriated ironically from capitalism, quote, the great thing in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. It is to fund and capitalize our acquisitions and live at ease upon the interest of the fund. For this, we must make automatic and habitual as early as possible as many useful actions as we can, and guard against the growing into ways that are likely to be disadvantageous to us, as we should guard against the plague. End of this quote. The ideal education, then, would empower students to evaluate and to revise habits as if automatically. Right? This sort of learning how to learn becomes habit, right? this involves this sort of evaluation and revision of habits as if automatically. Students would, as early as possible, cultivate the habit of cultivating intelligent habits. Habit, then, is not opposed to plasticity. It is not necessarily the automation of creative impulse. Habit is made possible by plasticity, but habit can also turn against it, mortify it, and empty it of its spontaneity and its genius. Only where education is in the service of plasticity and dedicated to the maintenance of its suppleness, which is to say, to the refinement of genuinely intellectual and unified dispositions capable of creatively reforming the practical environment, only then does real learning take place. And what else is learning at the most general level but the agency, or this is Malabou's phrase, an agency of disobedience to every constituted form, a site of resistance to the ideology that would bring an end to the plasticity, that enables our brains to form new neural networks and new agents of change. Today we are witnessing the instrumentalization and professionalization of education, especially in the public and the for-profit sectors, the spirit of vocationalism replacing the spirit of the liberal arts. More and more pressure is put on universities to produce the kinds of graduates demanded by the market. Talked a little bit about this at lunch. This reform misses fundamentally the meaning of education, which, as Dewey points out in Democracy and Education, education has no end beyond itself. It is its own end, namely the continual reorganizing, reconstructing, and transforming of ourselves and our environment. A truly humane education, he writes in Human Nature and Conduct, consists in an intelligent direction of native activities in the light of the possibilities and necessities of the social situation. He laments that, for the most part, adults have given training rather than education. An impatient, premature mechanization of impulsive activity after the fixed pattern of adult habits of thought and affection has been desired. The combined effect of love of power, timidity in the face of the novel, and self-admiring complacency has been too strong to permit immature impulse to exercise its reorganizing potentialities. That's the end of Dewey's quote. The tendency to instrumentalize education, to subordinate it to the flexible training demanded by the marketplace, is no doubt the product of those, as he puts it, practical men who praise subjection as a team spirit, or as team spirit, loyalty, devotion, obedience, industry, law and order, and who demand that the delightful originality of the child be tamed instead of nourished and grown. Today it may not be adults who are the primary obstacle to truly transformative education, but the leaders of business, industry, and educational institutions who regard learning as fundamentally a means of getting a good job. One last paragraph. Thank you for being patient. So reclaiming our plasticity, or retrieving its true potential, requires us to figure out not just what the brain can tolerate, but what the brain can do. We need to embrace and embody a spirit of resistance against the ideology of flexibility, marketability, and entrepreneurship. As Malabou encourages, quote, resistance is what we want. Resistance to flexibility, to this ideological norm advanced consciously or otherwise by a reductionist discourse that models and naturalizes the neuronal process in order to legitimate a certain social and political functioning, end of quote. Resistance of this order requires a more critical literacy of the brain, its determinacy and indeterminacy. It requires learning about our own habits, good and bad, and how to transform them. And it requires experimentation with the constitution and reconstitution of our plasticity, which inevitably asks us to open ourselves to accidents, to alterity, and to what may or may not render us unrecognizable to ourselves or desirable to our future employers. After all, if plasticity promises anything, it's an escape from the reductionism implied by the neurobiological image of subjectivity and the neoliberal image of freedom that has infiltrated the popular discourse of brain science, our educational institutions, and the politics of the workplace. Thank you.
Okay, hi, thanks for your talk. Very interesting and kind of opens a whole series of new avenues, new pathways, possibly new pathways. My question is this. First of all, are you familiar with the research that's being done on mirror neurons?
I mean, I've heard of it and
Yeah.
I haven't really listened.
I mean, what they're proposing is something of an alternative theory of learning. I mean, the idea is that cells imitate other cells. So at the cellular level, for example, they talk about the fact that in certain moments of gestation, you can remove a collection of cells that are on their way to becoming eye cells. And you can relocate them to an area where there are cells that are becoming kidney cells. And they become kidney cells. The same cells that are becoming eye cells become kidney cells, but by virtue of identifying with the cells in the environment. In other words, there's a mimetic or appropriative process that takes place, and the research in mirror neurons has a talk of. I'm wondering to what extent, if that proves to be accurate, that if our learning is really appropriative and mimetic, and we take on what's going on around us, how that would influence the understanding of habit that you're getting from Alba.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, I had the idea of education being sort of happening indirectly through the environment.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously I think that the habits of the students are going to be, they're going to mimic the habits that are sort of presented to them in the environment.
Right.
And I think Dewey's concern is, I'm not sure what Malabou's concern would be, but I think what Dewey's concern would be that this sort of mimetic process is mitigated to some extent, so that the habits of the teachers or the adults don't sort of colonize the children. And so it's going to require a certain restraint on the part of the adults.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it challenges what you're saying. I think in some ways it adds to what you're saying. Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking out loud with your. I mean, the notion of resistance could still come very strongly into play there, because one of the ways that there's always the potential for de-appropriating. I mean, if we find ourselves in an imitative environment, resistance would be the blockage of that natural appropriation.
Yeah. And this research on mirror neurons is sort of a cautionary bit of research.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
About the susceptibility of students.
That's right.
Yeah, thanks. I think you had your next.
First of all, I love the velocity reference by way of anecdote. When I first saw those commercials, I found them really frustrating because, I don't have cable, so I watch TV on Hulu, and Hulu goes through these they have like monthly commercial blocks basically, and I started to see these velocity commercials, and so if you guys haven't seen them, it's people like, well, I work out a lot, but I can never work out my brain. It's like these games you play. And I just remember thinking but I'm watching Hulu and reruns of Newhart or something, so I don't have to use my brain. I think if you look at it in terms of our sector of the job market, luminosity is really frustrating, because you're that's the last thing I wanted to do was find a way I can work out my brain. You want to turn it off. So I think it kind of depends on the audience. But what I was going to say was, this is the question, the sort of terminology I was thinking of when you were talking about this idea, is I couldn't help but think about Deleuze and the apparatus of capture. So I just wondered if you, to me it seems like that would be one sort of conceptual framework or a terminology that you could use if you wanted to connect it to that, because it seems like precisely that sort of thing. Now, I wouldn't necessarily myself relate it to plasticity, but if I made it even just creativity, right? And then you think about artistic subcultures that find a way to sort of deviate and, deterritorialize in the Deleuzian terminology, and then capitalism finds it and says, oh, as it turns out, this hip-hop thing can really sell a lot of records, can really pack some arenas. So even though they're basically challenging us directly through this music and this, this art form, graffiti, whatever it is, scratching classic records or whatever, right? the idea was like, oh, as it turns out that's really popular and we can make a ton of money off that, and instead of having it be a subversive voice against us, we can actually just make it a super capitalistic thing and a form of commercial music and everyday music, right?
Yeah.
So it sort of reminded me of that same thing. Again, it's not about plasticity or neuroplasticity, but it's a similar sort of thing, the capitalist mechanism being able to say, there's something that could potentially challenge us, why don't we just incorporate that into our own profit mechanism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I mean, I'm ready to take on whatever Deleuzian concepts I can. So, and yeah, this idea, if I understand right, this would kind of fit in with Malabou's idea that, you know, sort of capitalism confiscates this notion of plasticity. So it's confiscating this sort of this bit of research, right, and then capitalizing upon it and selling it back to us in the form of.
Yeah, I think it was in the first part of the paper that you had mentioned that, and that's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, but I'm glad you appreciate the luminosity reference too. But you're right. I didn't think about it. Like, you're watching television, and you know, this may be a cliched example, but it's atrophying your brain, and then saying, once you're done watching Newhart and your brain has lost enough sort of suppleness, we will sell you the solution to regain that sort of suppleness.
That idea of the cold media, right? Yeah. Like it's a passive reception of this media, but actually now the way like LED screens work and things like that, they can, you know, shouldn't watch TV too late at night. Why? It makes it really hard to go to bed. Why? Because of the way the light works and sort of fires your neuron. But it's this, hey, just sit back and watch TV, and then when you're done with that, maybe you should check out this website to help you rebuild those brain cells or whatever.
Right, yeah, thanks.
I kind of wanted to add a wrinkle to that question. So, but isn't it though also too that in this appropriation it becomes like denatured or like corrupted somehow, so that in the appropriation of plasticity it's no longer, it becomes mere flexibility or whatever.
Yes.
And so in your hip hop example, then a lot of the kind of cultural critical like eye that exists in the sort of more of the underground movement is also sort of stripped from it and sterilized, so that instead of having, you know, Black Star and Talib Kweli as the pop, you have Iggy Azalea and whatever else. So is that like, is there a necessarily like a corruption or a de-radicalization of the art form after as it's appropriated? Is that a way to?
Yeah, I think this idea of denaturing it. Yeah, when she talks about, you know, plasticity having this sort of tripartite structure, right? When it's appropriated, two of the components are dropped out, especially the sort of particularly the creative sort of element, right? And what we're left with is this flexibility, and then it's repackaged and sold back to us as, well, that's what plasticity is. It's flexibility, and it's praised, right? Plasticity is praised on the one hand, but what we're not told is its tripartite structure is praised, right? But we're told to sort of praise or adopt just that one element of the flexibility, and that's what's valorized and turned into a sort of virtue. Yeah, exactly. It's a political moment.
Yeah, I cut Tom off. I'm sorry, Tom.
No problem. You're following up, so I'm going someplace else. So I got 2 points. One is, you said that Dewey says that conservative habits are bad, and that seems too strong to me. It seems like there needs to be an understanding of the dialectic between the conservative and the intellectual habits, rather than a reduction to either one.
Yeah.
It seems like they could both be problematic. You can give any number of examples of that, right?
Yeah.
If I want to play basketball well, I need to learn how to shoot the shot, but I need to read the situation and move around. But when I get there, it needs to be rote at that time, right? It seems like there needs to be a balance of both of those. And then the second point is this idea of learning to learn and trying to teach a dogmatic society of doing that isn't a new idea, right? This is something that goes back to at least to Plato and Socrates. And so that raises the question then, is anybody here discussing how it is that you go about converting a community who's set up in terms of this kind of socio-cultural conservative way of acting to move into a learning to learn, more progressive way of going about doing things?
I'm sorry, say the last part again.
Just what's the, I don't know if I can say it. Is anybody here at Dewey or Malabou discussing, you know, where the rubber meets the road here? How do I go into a community that's already set up in terms of these conservative cultural habits
Mm-hmm.
and say, well, there's something wrong with this. We need to have this ideal of education where we have learning to learn as the ideal, right? That's Mark Twain's famous quote, right? Don't let your schooling get in the way of your education, right? How do we set that up as the ideal rather in a situation where everybody's already set up to say, hey, you know, it's like teaching intro students to philosophy, right?
Yeah.
They want the answers. Give me the answers and I'll give them back to you.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the way this class works,
Right.
right? How do you go about doing that? It seems like something that certainly Plato especially is dealing with and trying to tackle head on.
Yeah, no,
Struggling again.
I mean, obviously, that's a great question because what's the practical payoff
Yeah.
of this? Somebody asked me, I've only presented this one other time, and somebody asked, well, okay, so what does the education look like that we're kind of advocating here? And I was hesitant to say, well, it's the sort of Deweyan laboratory school model, right? But I take a little bit of a stab at it. It must have something to do with this idea that the education has to speak to the impulse of the pupil, right? I mean, put it in a different language. It has to talk, teaching philosophy, the philosophy has to in some way speak ready to the creative interests of the students, right? And obviously in a classroom, you have a whole bunch of impulses and you can't speak to each one of them individually, but I guess that's sort of the ideal.
Does that mean we have to send everybody over the age of 12 out to pasture? Right, that's the Platonic
Yeah.
suggestion.
I'm gonna remain agnostic.
Yeah.
But just to speak to your first question too, yeah, I think I sort of glossed over this equation of conservative and bad too quickly, and you're right to point out that it's more dialectical than that. And that's, for me, that's the challenge for me reading Dewey, is that everything in Dewey, everything is absolutely dialectical. You're constantly trying to juggle these two things at the same time. I would just like to take your example though, like in playing basketball. Yeah, there's a sense in which you have to have a kind of rote, mechanical, automated jump shot, right? But you also need to be able to, maneuver against the defense so that, and I think in that sense, it can't just be conservative, and that was your point about it being, it's got to also be sort of progressive, but always dialectical, yeah. But for the sake of, I guess, attaching a norm to each one of them, the conservative is bad, but like with anything, you never just have bad, you always have bad and good in this dialectical opposition, right? Unless somebody forces you to take half of that dialectic out, which seems to be his worry. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how to go with this, and you can go with, suppose Dewey is just completely wrong, so are you, or, there's some
It's
things
a
that
hypothesis.
might be considered for limitations. One is, it's like the book Habits of the Heart, the Bell book. And one of the problems with talking about habits like this is, you always have to ask the question, whose habits you're talking about anyway? And Dewey sort of pictures this happy little world of discourse and dialogue and growth and community knowledge and community appreciation, constantly, valuing ourselves. So this is certainly not the world of class divide, not the world of sexual exploitation, not the world of slavery, not the world of drug addiction, not the world of the guys who break into your checking accounts and saving accounts and medical records. This is certainly not their world. So that's sort of one. And there's sort of a cabinet that you can put on this picture, this little rosy picture of happy land of growth. The other is, how does this account for radical changes? Informative combination, revolutions, upheavals, destruction. I don't know how this little picture would seem to be, will make that thing not happening, doesn't occur, or it's an anomaly, or it's
Cognitive revolution.
yeah, it's kind of an illusion, or it's not really sort of sort of happy, joyous picture effect.
Yeah.
or it is, have to be accounted for some kind of perversion or mishap or so I don't know whether necessarily you're just wrong, doing it wrong too, or here's some things to think about that may need some clarity in account of plasticity of the student. Picture, even the picture of luminosity. You gotta have a TV or who to do this in the first place. And this is what we don't have either one. So give me an example is contingent upon a technology and a material resource that's limited to a certain kind and class of people in the first place.
Yeah, I mean,
So I'm showing a big picture here. Anyway.
I'm thinking, so, yes, yeah, no,
Passing. Nothing to take seriously.
yeah. When you first started, these are obviously great questions. When you first started speaking, I was thinking about Dewey talks about habit as sort of fundamentally taking root in class structures. Right, so the habit is first and foremost class-based. That's just a comment. But this idea of revolution, I was reading a book by Gail Weiss called Refiguring the Ordinary, and one of her critiques of James's notion of habit and plasticity was that it has no way of accounting for radical change and not radical novelty. And my sort of knee-jerk response was, I don't actually believe that those things exist. Radical change, right? Things that just kind of spontaneous revolution. And I don't know if that's true, but maybe it's the case that cognitive revolutions are always cumulative and take place over a long gestation period. That would seem to be the account that Dewey would have to give. But Malabou has this notion of, the third dimension plasticity is that this plasticity is explosive. And she uses the example that, plastic explosives, right? And I don't know if I buy that either. That's where I'm a little skeptical. It's like, yes, we have things that are called plastic explosives. That does not necessarily mean that plasticity is inherently explosive, right? It might be creative or formative to some extent, but explosive. And this is kind of what I have to look a little bit more into. In what sense is neuroplasticity explosive, right? Which seems to be a lot more extreme than creative.
Yeah, even in this picture of slow growth, you have absolute incongruity between communities, between classes. I mean, Dewey still thinks that he treats classes as not as in some ways congruous. They wind up getting along with one another. They don't wind up killing one another. They don't wind up destroying one another.
In Democracy and Education, he does claim that the sort of ruling class will, by necessity, be, or not by necessity, by nature, in a sense, be not only oppressive, but also sort of impulsive in the sense that it just does whatever it wants without, regard for the consequences, because it can afford to do that. And then the oppressed class will more often, or will, by virtue of being oppressed, be forced into these sort of rote mechanisms. So, I don't know if that.
No,
It's not a congruity, right? But a certain asymmetry, no? No? All right. Cognitive programs. Thanks. I have to think about this stuff.
Just as sort of, excuse me, just as sort of a first thought pops into my head, it sort of strikes me that the common element, at least as far as my understanding of Dewey would be concerned, between sort of this question about converting dogmatized or dogmatic population and the common thread about cognitive revolutions might be present in Dewey's conception of the consummatory phase, sort of the aesthetic moment as that possibility which makes future possibilities possible. And so in particular when we're talking about Dewey's answer is probably going to be public art, or at least something like that, to first show them that habits can be broken or different. Basically, the aesthetic as that moment of resistance that is implemented from without. And I sort of suspect that the cognitive revolution discussion could come from that as well, but the argument would be a little bit more circuitous.
Yeah. So you think maybe public art is the answer to his question?
I think that I could quite reasonably construct a Deweyan argument that public art is, or at least the consummatory phase of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
And of course, public art is typically where he talks about that.
Right, right. This is helpful. Yeah, I can look into this. Public art.
Well, I only say this, of course, because Dewey also sort of says that the consummatory phase is the site of democracy, right?
Yeah.
So it is what makes democracy possible.
The dissertation director is working on democracy in public art right now, so I'll have to go back and talk more, but he's not using Dewey at all, so that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Jake that Dewey's aesthetics is the key to everything. No, my question is actually, so this is more softball question for you. Okay, so you had said in your, I don't want to go after you like that.
I wasn't going after you. I'll be as kind as I could be.
If I wanted to be completely contrary, I could say, okay, starting on the basis that Dewey is right.
We'd expect nothing less after her.
Okay, so you had said in your, I guess it's technically the second section of your paper, you had said that self for Dewey is impulsively social. Is that a phrase that Dewey himself uses, or is that how you're kind of bringing together his ideas of impulsivity and self?
Yes, yeah, that wasn't his phrase. That was sort of.
Because it's such a good phrase, and I'm like, damn, let me know where that is in Dewey, so.
Yeah, no, it's just kind of a paraphrase of what I.
Okay.
Because there's always this problem of like thinking the natural and social, again, dialectically, always at the same time, without trying to assign priority to one or the other, and I think.
Well, the way that you say
impulsive-
that suggests that they're different things
The natural
already,
and social.
right? Yeah. Which is problematic too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess I was thinking about like, so, thinking about habit, is it primary, or is it kind of second nature, or is it first nature? But it's neither. We use these categories, but artificially sort of to, help us organize our thinking about habit acquisition. And
Okay,
impulsively
so-
social.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit and tell me what you mean by impulsively social? Like, I understand, okay, so you had defined impulsive as erratic or out of control. So can you say what that would mean for the self to be impulsively social?
I was just trying to, yeah, that's good, thanks, I have to clarify this. I was just trying to capture this idea in which there's a kind of, a way of contrasting his idea that the self is, as he put it, sort of egotistically self-centered, right? No, it's not self-centered, it's impulsively social, like it almost can't help but strive for sociality, right?
Yeah.
Reach out to be social,
Well, it is
to
social.
others, right? And sort of willingly be dependent upon others.
Okay, but to be a self for Dewey, first of all, is to be social.
Mm-hmm.
So where does the willfully being social come in? I think you're right, I'm
Yeah.
just asking for you to.
No, well, let me backpedal on the willful. I mean, sort of, not willful, sort of,
Intentional.
sorry?
Intentional.
No, I want it to be less than that. That's why the impulse, I don't know, I think impulsive captures it so well, because the
Yeah.
impulse is not intentional, but it's also not instinctual.
It's not just your, it's not just driven by you, or at least it's driven by you in the sense that you are social already, right?
Yes, but I don't want to say it's instinctual. I don't want to sort of like give it that kind of almost deterministic, you know, character. That's why I think impulse is this nice sort of liminal concept that's somewhere between, it's not quite desire, and it's not instinct, and it's not intention, you know, it's somewhere in between all of those things. It's sufficiently ambiguous.
So it's kind of impulsive and compulsive.
Compulsive. I have to think about compulsion.
Okay.
Compulsion.
I thought it was a fantastic phrase.
Okay.
I was really hoping that it really was Dewey.
Yeah, that's not only a softball question, but a nice compliment from this phrase. Thank you. Okay, I'll hold on to that one. I won't edit that one out of the paper. That's
If you do, I'll take it.
my bread and butter parent phrase. Thanks.
Professor Yeomans, did you have maybe one more question?
Sure, before we're out of time.
No, go right ahead. Yeah,
Okay,
then this will
so-
close it out here.
I guess I've got some doubts about whether in our rallies against capitalism we ought to have neural plasticity on our banners for a variety of reasons. So, first, I can sort of get to the idea that it's a good.
Yeah.
But it seems like the very definition of a private good rather than a public good. Right, so by analogy, I think yoga is a great practice and lots of people do it and it's a good thing for them. And musculoskeletal plasticity is a private good for them. But I can't really get to the idea that it's a public good and somehow there's a super individual social good if more people in West Lafayette do yoga, right? So I guess I've got similar barriers. I'm simply defining it in terms of brain structures.
Yeah.
Seems to make it the very definition of a private good. So that's, I guess, one sort of resistance that I have to the idea. The other sort of resistance I have is the idea that we really ought to understand capitalism as a closed system that is opposed to these creative forms of plasticity. And I guess I don't see it as being opposed to those at all. I mean, I think capitalism is much more the sorcerer's apprentice, right? And all of these things are happening and nobody's in control and it's creative destruction. And so I don't know that there's anything, for example, about entrepreneurship that wouldn't answer to all of the sort of positive or fuller sense of what Malabou means by plasticity, right? I mean, iTunes destroys the recording industry as it was known before then. Facebook destroys long-form journalism and so on, and imposes new forms and all of these sorts of things. And so I guess I'm not buying the idea that there will be a real structural difference between the kinds of growth that takes place under capitalism and sort of good growth.
Yeah. No, this, like we were talking at the break, that this is something I've yet to sort of think through. Just to clarify, when you're saying private good for plasticity, or you mean that in the sense of like personal good?
Yeah, something like that. Now, I mean, a way to go, I think, might be the aesthetics.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you can go that way with Dewey. You go that way with Marcuse, right? But I mean, that gets you something like a tradition of creativity, right? And that gets you this dialectic between the conservative and the creative part, or something like that. And then it's maybe easier to see how that's a public good in some way, as opposed to a merely personal good.
Yes, yeah.
Because, I mean, I think you're right to push back on that part, to push back on the identification of all goods with private goods, right? That's an essential feature of neoliberalism. That seems right to me as a diagnosis of capitalism, to push back. I'm just not convinced that brain plasticity can be the big.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts. This is kind of something that excites me about where this might be able to go, thinking through this problem. I guess two things. And forgive me, but this book that I have coming out, which is basically a revised version of my dissertation, I've hit upon aesthetics as sort of an aesthetics as a kind of experimental discipline, which is sort of key to solving some of these problems that I raise in here. And I think that's key, and I agree with a few of the people, including yourself, that this is the way to go towards aesthetics. But I guess what I was thinking is that if it's true that plasticity has a kind of receptive dimension, right? It can learn in this kind of receptive sense, but it's also creative, right? And then at the end of the day, what we care about, if we care about plasticity, is that the individual is capable of not only adapting, right, but pursuing inquiry on their own terms, and insofar as they become creative problem solvers who can adequately respond to unforeseen problems, right, at that sort of personal or private level. If we make the analogy between the individual and then society, the body and the body politic, then at a kind of collective level, we should be investing in plasticity as well. And if it's key to education and we care about education as a kind of public good, then there's a certain, it's incumbent upon us to protect this public good so that it's not sort of something that can be, as Malabou puts it, confiscated by private businesses.
Right, and then in a way, I mean, you could in a certain sense go with the sort of commutative nature of learning from the mirror neurons. I mean, in a way, what you want is similar to, right, this idea that's been coming up in all of the vaccinations, and what you want is herd immunity, right? What you want is herd immunity to exclusively conservative habits, right? And maybe you get that public good by educating a sufficient percentage of people to have these other kinds of habits as well.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe build it up in that way.
Yeah, perhaps. No, this is herd immunity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so maybe there are two sort of issues here. There's this threat of the colonization of society by conservative habits on the one hand, and then the sort of atrophying of individual and collective, at the end of the day, collective plasticity on the other. These are sort of the two threats here, and I think it's important for me to keep those two things separate. Yeah, thanks. I'll keep working on this. Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. Like I said, it's the second draft, and I think there's a lot of places to go or not go. Thanks for coming out and listening to the read paper to you.
Thank you.